Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ask the Expert webinar. What can formats do for you? My name is Tiago de Souza, and I will serve as your moderator for today's event. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our presenter, Christine Ridio, a Principal Technical Training Consultant here at SAS. Christine has been a technical trainer with the SAS Education Division for 25 years. She teaches courses on SAS programming, SAS Enterprise Guide, and statistical analysis. Prior to coming to SAS, she taught courses on science, math, and computer programming at colleges in Chicago and Washington, D.C. She has a bachelor's in astronomy from Carleton College and an MS and ABD in astrophysics from Northwestern University. Christine, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much. And hello to everybody. Hope you're all having a good day or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. As it said in the introduction, I came to SAS 25 years ago. And as I have worked with SAS over the years, I've grown very attached to formats and found that while probably everybody who does any kind of SAS programming uses formats to, say, add dollar signs and commas to salary data or euros, if you're in Europe, some other icon like that, that there are actually many more uses for formats. And so what I'm going to try and do is talk, first of all, about some format utilities to allow us to create our own formats, and then look at how we might use some of those. So let me get started here. In terms of utilities, I'm going to talk about creating permanent formats, using SAS data sets to create formats, and then we have not only the value statement, which you might be familiar with, but also the picture statement and in-value statement that allow us to create formats and in formats as well. So the first thing is formats are typically stored as catalog entries. And a single SAS catalog can contain several catalog entries. So if I create a formats catalog in my IA library, it will be called ia.formats, and then we have three different formats, which are then .revfmt.format, des.formatc, and roots.format. And with the C after it indicates that it's a character format. Now, if we want to see what formats are available, SAS by itself has over 400 formats. One of my favorites is the Roman format, which will write out your numbers in Roman numerals. I'm not sure there are many uses for that, but it's there if you need it. But SAS might not have all of the formats that we need. So for example, IA is International Airlines. It's a fictitious airline. And we might need formats for all the places it flies to. We might need formats to group the revenue in some way, or to specify the routes, how long they are, things like that. And so we can create our own formats. Now, if we want to create a permanent format, we can put it in a permanent library by using the library equals option and specifying ia.mylib or whatever I want to call this, ia.catalog, and so on, and then specify it within here. So with proc format, we can create formats. If we don't use this, the formats go into the work library, but we can put them wherever we want. Now, once I've created my permanent formats, I need to tell SAS where to look for those formats, because it doesn't automatically look in all of my libraries. So I can set the option format search, FMT search, and specify inside parentheses the different places that I want SAS to look and it will go through this list from 1 up to n, however many I've specified. This is the general order. It looks in its own formats first. Now, what this means is if I try and create a format called $, it's not ever going to find it because there's a $, format in SAS supplied formats. It'll always find that first. Then it'll look in the work library. Then it will look in whatever catalog I specify. So this is ia.formats. And down here, I've decided I want some other formats in ia.formats too. And that's the search order that we're going to get. Another thing that I might want to use is the no format error option, NOFMTERR. Sometimes you run into a situation where a format is on a server somewhere that you don't have access to, and without specifying the no format error option, SAS won't run your program when you use one of those formats. If that's what you want, then this is a toggle, format error or no format error. In addition, if you aren't sure where a format is that you've created, you can use the catalog procedure, and that manages entries in our catalogs. You can copy a catalog, list the contents of a catalog, rename or delete entries in a catalog, and so on. Another option that's available in proc format to actually see how formats are defined is the format lib, FMT-LIB option on the proc format statement. And this will give us a written report of what formats are in this library. Now, how do we get the formats into a library? Well, we're going to use proc format to create our formats. And I can create a format from a SAS data set called a control data set that contains the information that we want to include in the format. On proc format statement, we can use the control in option to read the data from the data set and create the format. Now, in order for this to work, our data set must contain the variables format name, start, and label. And we'll see in the demonstration exactly how we can create these. Another option, aside from the control in equals option, is to write a picture statement for numeric data. This defines a template for data values. So rather than saying EX equals excellent, as we might in a value statement, we're going to say that the value range 0 to 10 equals, and then we might say that we want leading zeros. So rather than just a 1, we want to see 0, 1. Or maybe what we want to see is asterisk, asterisk, asterisk 1, something like that. So the picture statement, once again, like the value statement, allows us to name the format, and then we set our value range 1. This could be low to high, low to 0, 0 to high, however we want to define it. And then we specify our template for how to write out those numbers. Now, with the picture statement, there are a number of options that are available. The no edit option says that if I put digits into my labels, that those digits are not digit selectors. That is, they're not saying I want to write out 1 as 001. They're saying these are just numbers that I want to display as part of the message. There's a prefix equal option that allows us to say we want a euro symbol as a prefix to our numbers. We want the fill equals option to say, I want all those asterisks if my number isn't big enough to fill up the whole space. And there's a multi equals option that says, how do I want to multiply the value before it's formatted? And that allows us to control things like, how do we write percentages out? We can also use the picture statement to specify how we want to write out SAS dates, times, and date times. And we use that by adding the data type equals option after specifying our template. So here's an example of using those date directives. Here we're saying, I want to call this format my FMT. I want all of my values from the lowest non-missing value to the highest value written out in this way. So this is going to tell us how to write out the day of the month. %B is how do I want to write out the month, and %Y is how I want to write out the year. And we're saying this is a date, okay? And notice there are dashes in here, and those dashes are just written out as text. Now, and we'll see examples of that, how it actually works in the demo. Now, the in values statement allows us to create in formats. These days, unlike in the earlier days when I started out with SAS, we don't often read in text files. Okay, most of our files that we want to read in are either already in a database or they're in an Excel file. That's probably the most popular, or they're comma-separated values. But there are ways and situations where I might want to take the values that I have in a data set and write them out with sort of special conditions. So I'm going to use an in format for that. And an in format is simply an instruction to tell SAS, here's how I want you to read this value in, and convert it and then save it. So a couple of the options here are underscore same underscore. And that just says, okay, this value, I just want to write out as it is. So maybe the values 0 to 10 are valid, but other values are not. So for 0 to 10, I would say write this out, underscore same underscore. But any other value, 10 to high or low to 0, I would write out as an error message, just like the error messages we sometimes get in SAS that shows us a data error. Another thing I might do is use the uppercase option to automatically uppercase all the input values. So maybe I have something where I have values for gender, and some of them are lowercase f, some of them are uppercase f, some of them are uppercase female. And what I want to do is use that uppercase option, maybe along with some other options, to specify that I want to uppercase every value before they're compared to the in format domain, so that I want those lowercase f's all to become uppercase f's as I read them in. Now I can use the in values with an input function, for example, if I want to convert values that I currently have. So that's a little bit about some of the utilities that we have for formats. Quick once over. Now let's take a look at format uses. Now the most obvious use, I think, probably If you've ever used a format, you've used a format for display. But we can also use formats to group data, and we can also use them for table lookups. And then we can use them for display in different ways than you might sort of automatically think of. Adding our dollar signs and commas, or taking a SAS date value and writing it out as 02/13/2025. So if I want to group data, there's a number of procedures in SAS where grouping data is going to give us more interesting and better results than if I use the data exactly as it is. Here we see proc_freq, proc_means, proc_gchart. And as an example, in proc_freq, maybe I have hire dates for the 10,000 people that work for Orion Star International Airlines. And if I do a proc_freq with just the raw hire date, I'm going to maybe get one person was hired on December 15th, 1984. And 3 people were hired on May 5th, 1997. That's not particularly useful, but I could have a format that, let's say I have the month and year format so that I can see that we have 10 people hired in December of 88, 1 person hired in January of 89, 3 in February of 89, or I can even add a format to do it year by year. And the same thing is true with proc_means and proc_gchart, and other procedures as well. We can also use this in the data step. There is a group format option in the data step where I can use this with some cases of by group processing. So I would say by group format and then the variable name. And optionally, I can add the not sorted. So it might be that I have a format that I'm going to apply to this variable, and the format will allow us to group it. So I might have airline flights. Some are going to be international, some are going to be domestic in the United States. And I can say I want to do this processing by group format flights, whatever my variable name is, and say, well, it's not sorted because we might have Anchorage and Amsterdam, and then all of a sudden Chicago comes in, and then we have Atlanta, something else. And so it's not sorted by the actual value of the variable, but it is based on the format. Now, group format is only available in the data step, and it's useful when you define formats that group the data. And it allows us to process in the data step the same groups of data as a summary procedure or with proc report. So we mentioned 3 of those summary procedures, but there are others like proc report. Now, another thing we can do in addition to grouping is do lookups. So oftentimes when we want to do something like this, we immediately think about merges as the way to look up values. So I might have a small table of continent codes. So 91 is North America, I believe 92 is South America, 93 is Europe, and so on. And I could merge that small table of lookups with my large table of customers that has, millions of customers in it. But that might not be very efficient. Instead, what I could do is create a format that says, well, 91, write out North America. 92 right out South America, and so on. Here we have something where we have model numbers, and each of those models has a name. It might be Jet Cruise LF5000 or LF5100 or SF7000. And we want to display these values, the names of the different models, rather than just their code numbers. The same way we might want to display the continent name rather than code number. And so we can create that format and then apply it as a way to do a table lookup. Now, third way we can use formats for display, and that might be pretty obvious, but there are some additional options that we can apply. So for fuzz, this is an option that says, how close do we need to be to display the number this way? And the fuzz value, the default is something like e to the minus 12. Don't quote me on that, but it's a small number. But we can change that if we want to say all of these numbers should go in this bucket, basically. The not sorted option, ordinarily when I create a format, in the background, proc format is going to sort that. But if we want it to be not sorted, if we know how the values come up in our data, then we can be more efficient using the not sorted. And then there's a multi-label. I can create a format that, for example, might take my dates and group them first by season, winter, spring, summer, fall, and then also group them by year. Okay. And if I add multi-label, there are certain procedures that will use us, like procfreq or proctabulate, to display both sets of groupings at once. Then we can nest formats. So it might be that for dates before 2000, I just want to see the year. But for dates after 2000, I want to see the year and month. Well, I can nest those formats and create another format that uses both of those. And then last thing I'm going to mention is using formats for colors or traffic lighting. Okay, so we can go in there and we can highlight certain values. If I see I have a bunch of people whose salaries are under 40,000, I might want to take a look at that and figure out why that's the case. What's the characteristics there? Or if I see some country has got sales over $1 million, whatever is a good value for our company, then I might want to highlight that and give them a green light, so to speak. So again, the fuzz option allows us to map a value if it's close enough. And here, 1e to the minus 12 is a default value. The not sorted option, again, saves processing time and preserves the order that we define the ranges. And you can use this with the preload format option to maintain the order in certain of our procedures. Here's the multi-label option, comes after our format name and parentheses. And tabulate means in summary allow us to do this. Again, nested formats. This is great if we want a modular report or approach rather. And if one format isn't really what we want across the entire range. We can apply colors, so I can say, 0 to 10 is going to be red, 10 to 100 is going to be yellow, and 100 to high is going to be green. that's basically where the traffic lighting term comes from. And I can then use this with Proctabulate in particular by applying the style equals or S equals option to say, use that color coding to specify the background style or color. And I can also use it with proc report using a compute block for variable you want a traffic light. So that's just a whiz tour through some of the formats. Let's go take a look and see how this actually works. So let me share my screen. And I've got this set up in Enterprise Guide, and I've made the process flow a little bigger. I mentioned early on that SAS has itself hundreds of formats. I wrote a little program that's still not quite got everything I want, but here I have a list of some of the SAS supplied formats. We can write this out in various hex formats or binary formats, ASCII formats, and so on. And there's many more. This is 43 of about 400 and some. So let's take a look at, got two sets of examples here. This is the utilities. So let me bring this up. I've already run this, so I have a library called IA here, and that has my pretend international airlines data. And you can see we have employees, passengers, schedules, and so on. And here we're just doing a proc format to write into that library our employee levels. And we've got levels A and B for our top people, and then everybody else is grouped into levels 1 through 6. Okay. Then we have another value statement. We can have more than one in proc format. And here's our value dest. And for dest, we're going to take all of these, which include Auckland, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Athens, and many others. And those are our international flights. And then we have Anchorage, Birmingham, and so on that are our domestic flights. And typically, if I'm writing a report, most people would not be able to guess that ARN, unless they're a frequent traveler, is Stockholm. Why? Because the Stockholm airport is called Arlanda. And they wouldn't necessarily know that BHM is Birmingham, Alabama. So we write out the groupings here. And then we set our options for our format search and our no format error. And then we're going to do a proc print and just take a look at this. Now I've already run this, so I want to look in the log first, and we see that our library was assigned. Since I've run this a number of times, it says it's already on the library, but there it is once again. Same thing for this. And then we have our information from proc print and proc contents. And let me zoom this a little bigger too. Here we can see Paris is CDG for Charles de Gaulle, and the country is France. And we might want to use something like this to actually create even more robust cities data. Okay. Now, here we go. We're going to take that cities data that we just looked at, and here we're going to read from that. And in reading from it, we're going to rename code to start and city to label. And we're going to retain our FMT name variable and give it the value $city. This is going to be a character format, and so we need to precede the name with a $sign. Now this way, SAS will still have to read IA.cities, but we won't have to go through a lot of machinations about every time saying format name is $city, or every time we go through start equals code. So we're saving ourselves some effort by doing that. And then we just run our proc format with our control n equals option. And then we're going to use that to specify the origin and destination using that format that we just created. And so I can continue looking in the log. And we're going to build our control data set. And then we're going to create $city. And then we're going to use it. Okay. And here in our results, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. And here's our new format. Now notice LGA and DCA are written out as they're stored in the data. And that's because in our format, we didn't have DCA and LGA. We did, however, have Dallas, Fort Worth, and Los Angeles and Chicago. Okay. So what we might want to do is go back and add in the rest of these. And there is a control out option that will allow us to output the data set, the format to a data set. And then we can go ahead and add in the new values. Now here's a couple of examples of the picture format. Here I'm creating a format that I'm calling feet, and I'm saying everything because I don't have any other values listed. Other means every value, and here are my digit selectors, and it says I want at least one digit here, and if there are digits, if the number is higher than 9, then write out whatever digits there are. But if there aren't any other digits, just, leave the space. And this time we're going to use our multiplier equals 5280. And so I've just got a mini data set here that we're going to input from our cards here, miles. So this is 1 mile, mile and a half, and 2. And then we're going to format this using our feet picture format. And then what we'll use the label for miles to be feet, and our proc print will convert miles to feet just using a format. So again, I look here, scroll down a little bit, we get our format feet, and then we get our data set feet, and finally our proc print. And I look at that, and so 1 mile is 5,280 feet. This is the OBS to 1.5 miles, 7,920, and 2 miles, 10,560. Okay. Here, we're saying we want to write out currency. Now, this is going to be for salaries, and we can't use dollars, so we're going to call it currency. We want all the values that aren't missing to be written out with a comma separator. We know none of the values is more than 999,000 approximately. And here we're using the multiplier 001 and a prefix of $. And we're going to apply that currency for the crew in our proc print. And here we have our salary in thousands. Okay. And we can see we've just written out the values with no comma 000. If I now create salary and I want it low to high, here I'm going to add in decimal places. So I want to get the number down to pennies, which may be going away, who knows. And I'm saying if the salary isn't big enough, then use asterisk to fill out the space and use a $sign. And here we see the fill. So here, notice we don't really need to have the decimal places because they're all 0.00, but we get the asterisk and the $sign. Then let's take a look at this no edit. Okay, so here we have 3 different picture formats: del group, del GX, del GY. And the first 2 have the no edit, and the third one doesn't. Okay, and for the first 2, here the only real difference is here we're saying print out the number of minutes of delay for a flight, but we want either 1 or 2 digits. So if it was only delayed by 2 minutes, just write out 2 minutes delay. Down here we're saying we want to write out 0.2 minutes delay. And then we're going to do our proc report, and we're specifying a title saying we want no edit with 09, with 99, and then without no edit, so that we can see what that no edit does. So let me take a look here. So here, when I take a look at this, come down here, let's say to this line that I'm highlighting, what we see is 2 minutes delay, 0.2 minutes delay. So the no edit with 99 adds the leading 0, and then 0.9 with 2 minutes delay. Okay. And then we have a delay greater than 10 minutes, and with without no edit, it's going to turn into 15 minutes or 17 minutes. Let me go down. I have a couple of examples. I'm going to skip over where we have data type date. Here we have some dates that are pre-merger. Here we want to put in the month during the merger process and then post-merger. And for those results, we get things like here, hire date for Johann Chopra or Joanne Chopra was March during the merger process. And then one of the more interesting ones, I think, is this. We're going to create an in format here where we're going to give a score to excellent, good, fair, and poor. Now, it turns out our data, our raw data, looks like this. So we're going to read these in two ways. We're going to read in the employee ID first, and then we're going to read in at position 6 using our eval in format, which is the one up here. We're going to start back at 6 again and read in our values just as character strings. Okay. And we come down here and we can, take a look at these results. And where do we go? Here we go. So this is the evaluation here where we used our new in format. Shows if all of these are now numeric values, okay? Whereas the string version just reads them in as they're typed in, okay? And so that can be handy if I have some evaluation and people are free to write in what they want. I can then convert this and use it in a couple of different ways. Now, I've got one more here with a couple of examples. Oops, I'm gonna just run through these. The first part of this is grouping the data, and I can just look at the results. If I don't group my dates, I see a lot of ones. When I do group the dates using a format, I see numbers, and I can see the same kind of thing with proc means. Here we've got an example of using a format to display the models with their names instead of with the numbers. And so here we still have the model num, and here we have the model name. Okay, so that's an example of lookup. Then here we have the multi-label example, where I've divided the dates into 3 groups before January 1st, 1985, 85 to 90, and then 90 to high. And down here in proc means, I can use the MLF option to write out the data using both ways to write these out. Let's see. So here we've written out the invalid models, and here's the multi-label format. So it gives us the year, and then it gives us the 3 groupings and the statistics for each of them. Here I've got a nested format where up to 89 I want word date. And then for anybody hired after 89, I just want to write out that they're not eligible for whatever benefit it is. And so here we see not eligible. Let me, then a date, another not eligible, and so on. And here we have our format where we're looking at traffic lighting. And so here we've got whites and blues, and then we have DERP, which is something like a deep red color, deep red purplish. These are SAS names for some of these, and I haven't remembered all of them. And then we can use it in ProcTabulate and ProcReport to specify background and a foreground color. So we've got background and foreground formats, and I can specify those with the style equals option here in ProcReport, and with the S equals option here in ProcTabulate. And I'll just scroll down, and there, this may be a little more gaudy than you want, but this will at least give you an example. Here's our proc tabulate code where we're coding based on the values of the salary. And here we have a proc report where, again, we're coding based on the values of the salary and modifying both the background color and the foreground color. And that's it. So a very quick once over, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes. Thank you. With that, we will be moving into the Q&A portion of the webinar. All right, Christine, now onto our first question here. What is a control data set?
Well, a control data set is a data set that you have set up so that it's in a form that proc format can read and use. So there's control in, which means this is going to be an input data set to proc format. And then there's control out, which is something where we're going to ask proc format to create a data set that has the values in it that we can then modify. And the option would be used on the proc and there goes our troublemaker cat. The option would be used on the proc format statement. And I might say, control in equals work.shadow. That's the name of the cat.
Thank you. On to our next question here. Is upcase the only option for the in value, or is lowcase also available?
I don't believe there's a lowcase option. I can double check on that and see, but I'm pretty sure it's only upcase.
Thank you. Someone's asking, with the multiplier and the picture format of 0000009, what happens if the resulting value is a non-integer? Does it round to the nearest integer based on that picture?
Yes. Now, a couple of things about numbers. SAS formats always round. User-defined formats don't necessarily round unless you put the round option, and that would go on a value statement. So if I have, or a picture statement, if I have something where I have decimals, then I would add the round option to say, I don't want to just truncate this. I want to actually round it.
Thank you. Another question here. If you want to share a SAS data set with a colleague, how might you send both the data set and the formats to the external colleague? Is it as simple as creating a control data set, or are there any other ways?
Well, you can use, there are a couple of other things you could do. You can use the proc catalog to copy out the formats. You could also take a format catalog if you wanted to write out several different formats and write those out to a catalog that you could then send. And there's a select option in proc format that allows you to say, I don't want all 25 of these formats, but I want to send the formats for employee name and employee location. So I want to select those two formats to send out. So you could use that along with proc catalog to send these to a colleague.
Thank you. Someone's asking, is it possible to create a format with the same name of a native one?
No. SAS won't let you do that. And even if you could do that, it would never find it. Say I wanted to create a dollar format. SAS has a dollar format, and so it'll look in the SAS defined formats first, and it'll never see our dollar format, but it won't allow you to create it to begin with.
Thank you. Another question here. What is the best option to avoid rounding problems with decimals when the total percentage sums up to 99.9% or 100.1% instead of 100%?
Well, depends on exactly what you want to do. If you want to round, you can add the round option. If sometimes you might want to see, and for example, in Proc Report, maybe you're adding a summary line that says the total percentage for Sweden is 102%. You could add something in Proc Report that says percentages may sum to more than 100 under certain conditions or something like that, and use it as a footnote to a table. That's one possibility. Now, I think you're mainly going to run into those issues. Well, that might not be true. I think the big area where you're going to run into those issues is with Proctabulate and Proc Report, because they do the summary lines. But you might run into it if you use something like the N-levels options with Proc Means. So it really would depend on what you want to do and how you want to round things. Rounding, if you had the round option, is going to round the way you would think it would. If the percentage was 99.9, it's going to round to 100. If it's 100.1, it'll round to 100.
Thank you. Someone's asking, can I use formats for other style attributes than colors?
Yes, good question. Yes, you can create pictures that you want to put in, say column headers or column values. So you could create a format. When the output delivery system was first coming into play back when I started at SAS, being a former astronomer, I created some formats that used pictures of planets, the Earth and Saturn, for inner and outer planets, and plug those into a table for, I think it was Proctabulate. And then there are also a number of examples in some of our ODS courses about using URLs. So I might have summary report that has Australia, Canada, Belgium, down to UK and US and so on. And I want to link to the detailed reports on those countries. I can create a format with a URL as the value, as the label.
Thank you. Another question here, is using a format for a table lookup more efficient than a merge?
Well, that depends. We used to have a course where we talked about efficiency, and a lot of that has been wrapped into Programming 3. But one of the slides had a picture of a couple of people having a picnic, and the label for the slide was no free lunch. There's always some cost when you're trying to join data from different data sets. And one of our former instructors, who's now retired, did some testing with this and tested if then else and formats and arrays. Might have done something else. Those are the ones I remember. And if I have two values, if I'm going to say, if the airport code is ANC, then the flight is domestic, and I only have a couple of values for airport codes. If then else works perfectly fine. If I have 1,000 values, I don't think I want to type in if then else. And Roger, the guy who set this up, said at 100,000 if then else kind of crashed. So it turns out that things like if then else are good for very small numbers. Formats are good for sort of intermediate ranges up to, say, 1,000, maybe a few more values. And then arrays and hash objects are good for larger numbers. Finally, if you get too gigantic data sets, you may be stuck with doing a SQL join or a merge.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you, Christine, for your answers, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Before we go, I have a quick reminder for you about SaaS Innovate 2025, our premier conference for business leaders, technical users, and SaaS partners. We'll have inspiring keynote speakers, practical hands-on workshops, insightful breakout sessions, and much, much more. It's all happening from May 6th through May 9th in Orlando, Florida. You can visit saas.com/innovate to learn more and to register. On behalf of myself, Christine, and Shadow, and all of SaaS, we really hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.